There is a growing trend of closing civic space in Uganda. The Civicus Monitor 2021 report rated civic space in Uganda as repressed, to mean that civic space is significantly constrained despite the existence of civil society organizations whose work, especially in advocacy for democracy, human rights, accountability, rule of law, and constitutionalism, is regularly impeded. Acfim's recent study on the state of civic space in Uganda highlights human rights, rule of law, freedom of assembly, and association as the most restricted civic space dimensions affecting citizen organizing.
The more this space shrinks and people actually begin fearing their government, fearing to speak out, then democracy is really endangered.
According to the study, a number of restrictive and draconian laws have been enacted to restrict civic space and constrain citizen organizing. Some of the laws singled out include the Computer Misuse Act 2011, the Public Order Management Act 2010, the NGO Act 2016, the Anti-Terrorism Act 2002, and the Press and Journalist Act 1997, among others.
And we are seeing a rapid descent towards authoritarianism, and this is not a phenomena that Uganda wants to see.
The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development Assistance Committee has made a draft of recommendations on enabling civil society in development cooperation and humanitarian assistance to respect, protect, and promote civic space in line with rights to the freedoms of peaceful assembly, association, and expression.
We strongly believe that, including government, to ensure that there is a conducive space where access to information is enabled, systems are in place to ensure that, yes, the law is implemented as required.
In today's episode, we zoom in on the state of civic space in Uganda and its implication on the future of citizen organizing.
Welcome to Acfim Talks, and that's the opener that brings us into this discussion. It's the state of civic space in Uganda. What does the future hold for citizen organizing? Your host is Felix Kafuma, and once again, you are most welcome today, the Friday, 18th of November. Your host. I have with me two distinguished guests that I will be introducing in a short while. But before I get into that part where I introduce my guests, let me first take this opportunity to invite everybody out there who is just tuning in for the first time to log in onto our social media platforms. We are live on Twitter. Our handle is at Acfim UG. We're also live on YouTube, Acfim UG, and also we are live on Facebook. You'll be able to get the notifications, and you will not be missing any of these these weekly Acfim Talks episodes that we have been running for the last 2.5 years, almost making 3 years. And at that juncture, also allow me to bring on board or bring in focus our guests for today. I'm joined by a lady and a gentleman, both of them with a legal background. Let me start with the lady. She's called Bukira Maria. You are most welcome. I hope I can hear you and you can hear me.
Yes, Felix. Thank you for having me.
Yes, Bukira Maria works with Women's Pro Bono Initiative, where she works as the advocacy and communications manager. She is a human rights lawyer and she's a human rights lawyer and a women rights activist. Currently working with Women's Pro Bono Initiative. She's also a social justice lawyer, passionate about social change. And like I said, she mainly works as an advocate for women's rights through research, advocacy, and media. It's great to have you, Bukira Maria, on today's edition of Acfim Talks.
Thank you, Felix.
Our other guest is Okot Robert, who is a regular on Acfim Talks. Okot is also a human rights lawyer, has worked with National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, NDI, also worked with Alliance for Finance Monitoring. He has supported into the drafting of the campaign finance bill. He's a political finance regulation and legislative advocacy expert. He's also an expert in non-profit law. He's currently doing part-time work with PILAC, and PILAC is Public Interest Law Clinic. Okot, it's good to have you again on set.
Thank you very much, Felix. And you're welcome,
right.
Maria.
Thanks,
All
Robert.
right. Today, like I said, we are discussing the state of civic space in Uganda, and both my guests have a legal background. And also both my guests have had a stint. One is still working within the civil society sector. The other has had a stint within the civil society sector and still does part-time work on public interest litigation. And let me start with you, Maria, from where you are at, just briefly, to give us your take on the current state of civic space. You've seen the different ratings by Civicus. Freedom House rated Uganda as civic space as not free, and yet Civicus rated Uganda's civic space as restricted and constrained. Acfim's recent study also has rated Uganda's civic space as restricted. What is your take?
Okay, thank you, Felix. First of all, I believe that those two mean the same things. It's a matter of semantics, that if something is not free, it's actually restricted. So when you're looking at the civic space in our country, you're going to look at various aspects. You're going to look at the social context, you're going to look at the legal frameworks, and ranging from that, we can see that there has been restrictions in terms of the social context, in terms of organizing, in terms of freedoms of expression, speech, but all these restrictions are manifest through the legal frameworks. The legal framework is one of the tools being used to repress and restrict the liberties that we have as civic actors, civil society actors, to operate within this civic space. So one may inquire, what is the civic space? So civic space, it's this layer between the state, business, family, in which citizens can organize, debate, and act on whatever issue. It can either be political or non-political. So we have seen instances where even the non-political discussions have been targeted, that people's freedoms, once you're having a discussion and it's even just light banter, but as long as the subject of the discussion is a political head, you have been seeing people being witch hunted, people whisked away in drones, threats being made, even to as something as light as a tweet. So from that, it is evident that our space is not free. And it's something that is very saddening to see, because while we organize in this civic space, it's not just only for issues of political activism, it's back to the day and day living of people, because all these issues go down to affect even the people in the communities who might not be directly acting in political environments.
Thank you so much, Maria, for providing that bit of a context. This is why I bring you in, Robert. I've seen you on a number of occasions helping civil society organizations whose permits was either suspended or recalled for non-compliance. And I think you relate very well when you talk about a restricted civic space. But just quickly, what are your thoughts? Where we are as Uganda, what are your thoughts on the civic space in terms of the context?
First of all, Felix, I would like to say that civic space is an important aspect of any free and democratic society. And that again plays into the rule of law aspect. However, for this to be realized, the state needs to uphold its international and national obligations when it comes to protecting and ensuring that the people that enjoy this civic space have their rights enjoyed without hindrance. And when you talk about rights, in this instance, we are looking at free speech, we are looking at freedom of assembly, and then the freedom to express themselves. Now, Felix, when we talk about attacks on this civic space, this is not something new. We've previously seen political entities being attacked. For instance, the Uganda Young Democrats used to be one of those entities attacked. You also had at one time the FDC people being attacked on a regular basis during the walk to work demonstrations. The difference today is that we are now seeing civil society organizations also being brought into play. And we should be aware that civil society itself has a big impact it plays when it comes to community development and mobilizing or organizing communities. However, Felix, the things that we need to also ask ourselves, why would the state be so much feel threatened by the growth of civic space or the flourishing of civic space? You have a number of civil society organizations, for instance, that have very big budgets. So they are able to run programs that have the capacity to mobilize citizens, either from agitating for free pads for girls to remain in school, or to get citizens to exercise their suffrage rights. So if you're a state that wants to be in control, you would be worried about the flourishing of such entities. But again, Felix, you also need to know that for the last about 20 years, our international or development partners have increasingly cut budget support to the government and instead channeled that support to civil society organizations, which are trying to see that civic space is as free as possible. So in a way, you find that the state looks at civil society entities as competition. You should not be surprised that the DGF has been under closer scrutiny in the recent few years. And also not shocking that DGF has also found the environment unpalatable, and that's why they're probably closing operations here. But what we need to note is that these are things that are not going to stop, because the moment you allow civic space to flourish, as a state that wants to continue being in power, you will always ensure that civic space is in check.
Thank you so much, Robert. You raise it. There are two things that are significantly standing out in your submission. The issue of state control versus regulation, and you've given a background that kind of like justifies the government actions towards citizen organizing, especially targeting civil society organizations. And let me bring in here Maria, because you're a civil society actor. Is the state misunderstanding civil society organizations, or this is more about the state being threatened by the prominency of civil society? Is it a is it an issue of misunderstanding civil society, or is an issue of threat civil society presents to the state? And when we talk about threat, is that a perceived threat, or is that threat real? I thought civil society is supposed to complement government. What is the problem here?
Thank you, Felix. First of all, I do not think it's a misunderstanding. I believe our state has the resources, human resources of legal personnel who can best advise it on how to understand the operations of civic society working with the state. So I do not think this is something that is a misunderstanding. This is a calculated consolidation of power. That's what it is for me. When you speak about the context within which we operate and we're having this discussion of power dynamics, we have to understand that yes, the state has power. It was given power through the social contract that we had with the state. We gave it power through elective processes that are supposed to be democratic, to have a responsibility to fulfill obligations to protect, to promote, and observe human rights, everyone's human rights. Now, the question comes in when the state finds itself in a situation that is, how should I term it? They are operating outside the scope of the power given to them by the people, or even they are not legitimate, as would term it. It might be a bit complicated to explain, but what I mean that if this is a government that is democratically elected by people, they should not have unrealistic fears that the people that they elected, who organize themselves in different clusters, because there's also this understanding that civil society misconception, which I believe misinformation is also one of the tools used by the state to drive its agenda. But what I'm driving at is that the misconception that the state, that civil society and community are two distinct things. No, they are not. Civil society is for the community. It is the community. So when you have a community losing hope in the state and finding ways to solve problems that are primarily the responsibility of the state, you see that their relevance becomes questionable. And that becomes an issue of threat. And when they see that threat, they start finding ways to consolidate, to restrict through legal measures, through operative of security forces. All of these things are reflection of a state that is in, I wouldn't call it panic mode, but getting to panic mode. Because as you said, civil society is supposed to be seen as a complementer, a development partner, because most times when they actually speak of development partners, they think about donors outside. No, the local community is a development partner. We contribute to the development of the nation. So instead of enhancing the ability of the community to complement the programs of government, we're seeing that it's being restricted. That even you saw the examples that happened, that organizations that are doing work for women's rights and everything, their accounts were frozen and threats of terrorism bunched on them because the state was in panic mode. And this, if you see the trend of restrictions, tightening of bolts by the state, it's usually around the elective process. Of course, there is that general state of restriction, but towards elections, you see that the freedoms are more restricted, the measures become even more blatant and shameful. They become more shameless, that people are just whisked away in drones without any shame. And the question is, why is civil society being seen as a threat? It's being seen as a threat because of the position our current government is in. this is a government that has been in power since 1986. So really, there are questions about the democracy, about the exercise of rule of law. And if you see the state coming up with the excuses of civil society is painting the government badly to donors so that we can get funding, but we are speaking facts, we're speaking evidence, and we turned to the government, given their power and obligation to exercise what mandate they are supposed to do, and they're not acting. So if there are different ways for people to organize, to find a solution, because it all comes down to one thing, for the better good of the people. So one way or the other, community will find a way to have a solution for the better good of the people, either through the government or through civil society organizing. There has to be a way that even the last person down, commonly known as Omuntu wa wansi, has a solution. So if the solution is not coming from the government, it can come from within us, and that support can be systematic through the civil society organizing. But that should not be seen as a threat if our government was proper in terms of exercising the principles of democracy. Yes.
Oh, thank you so much. And I'll have a follow-up question at some point talking about a government with delegated authority. Probably we have to look at how the process through which we delegate the power to government, the power you talked about. But Council Court.
Yes.
This big animal called civic space. I know most people struggle when you talk about civic space. They tend to limit it to about 2 or 3 dimensions. Majority relate civic space with freedom of information and expression, and freedom of assembly, or the right of assembly and association. But unpack, because I know to talk about civic space, we are mainly talking about 5 dimensions, just to help someone who is trying to figure out what is it that we are discussing when we talk about civic space, and as you unpack it, put it in the context of Uganda as well. That in terms of these different dimensions as a country, from your perspective, this is where we are. This is how this is manifesting.
Felix, maybe what I need to remind you is that civic space is a creation of universally accepted rules that create an environment where the citizens are free to organize, participate, and also engage in meaningful lives with themselves. Now, when we look at a country like Uganda, you could say that in the last 20 years of this regime, you've seen a downward trend when it comes to enjoyment of civic rights or civil society or enjoyment of the civic space. But you see, you also need to look at the impact of having a long life government. Because as the government grows older, some of these issues keep coming up. And you see, when I was introducing, I had started giving you some of the incidents that have shown that downward trend. For instance, from around 2006 elections, you could see that violence has been increasing during elections. And some of the people that suffer as a result of that is people that help the citizens to organize, or people that mobilize the citizens to exercise their rights, including the right to vote or suffrage rights. And then when it comes to 2010, 2011, you again see attacks increasing. You're seeing civil society entities being attacked, their offices being broken into. That is not by mistake. But what we need to know is that these attacks are not against civil society organizations. This is a war against civil liberties. Because the moment you close down civil society entities, it means that these people that have been benefiting from the services of these entities are cut off. Therefore, their liberties are also hindered. You've seen cooperative societies being destructed. You've also seen religious institutions either being co-opted to be blind to the happenings of the day or being attacked as well. But in all this, what we need to know is that these developments should be worrying all of us, because the rights that we advocate for in this civic space are not rights that are given by the state. These are inherent rights. But again, when you look at it, the state uses both administrative and legal measures to control this space that we are talking about. You've seen those suspensions that have been handed down to civil society organizations. That was not the thing before. Previously, they would simply break into some of these entities. But now, the law seems to be the easiest means of closing this space. So, you have provisions in the NGO Act, in the Anti-Money Laundering Act, being used now to close the civic space. Today, if you want to register an NGO, the bureaucratic processes that you have to go through are so cumbersome that you must really be interested. You must have that energy, in addition to having a good amount of money on you, for you to brave through these processes, for you to be able to register an NGO. You'll be told to go and seek a recommendation from the ministry. You'll be told to go and seek a recommendation from the district of operation. You'll be told to go and seek so many other documentations which make it hard for you to register as an NGO. And even when you register, the compliance measures that have been put in place put these entities in a position whereby they concentrate on compliance as opposed to doing the work they have set out to do as an entity. And the end user or the end consumer of services of these entities, the citizen, is the most affected. And that is why I earlier on said that we may not wholesomely say that this war is against civil society organizations, but against civil liberties.
Thank you so much. You are still watching Acfim Talks, and we are looking at the state of civic space in Uganda. What does the future hold? Council was trying to take us through perspectives and context, the different dimensions, the freedom of information and expression, freedom of assembly and association. Under there, issues around access to information, whether it is granted by law and respected in practice, whether freedom of expression is granted by law and respected in practice, issues around media freedoms, internet freedoms as well, as the rights of assembly, association. Then in there, you bring in civil society, whether it's able to function independently, free of government interference. What about the enabling fiscal environment? for CSOs. But there's something around the citizen participation that speaks to elections being free and fair. And I want Maria to comment, because you partly touched it, but when you were talking about the delegated function of the delegated power that we give to the state, and in a democratic dispensation, that power is through an elective process, and whether I want your honest opinion and comment on when it comes to citizen participation as a dimension, but in principle, whether the elections do provide an environment that really guarantees effective citizen participation, and whether the processes have integrity to guarantee that you have leaders who don't abuse power. And also, in terms of non-discrimination and inclusion, whether you see equal access in the way people exercise this participation, especially looking at women. How are they represented? How are their views and issues carried as we exercise these civic liberties that Okot talked about? Just a quick comment from you.
Thank you, Felix. Pardon again on the question, the brief exact excerpt I'm supposed to talk about. You gave a lot of background.
Yes, I was trying to just mirror what Councillor Okot was saying, but I drew your attention to the dimension of participation, and in there, when you talk about participation, talking about one of the key principles under participation speaks to elections being free and fair, because and the reason why I brought you into this is because I want you to comment, first of all, to comment on from your experiences, whether the dimension of citizen participation through elections does guarantee participation of citizens, and whether the elections are free and fair and credible, to also guarantee the power delegated to government not to be abused, and also in there whether women's rights are fully accorded, respected as they participate when we talk about citizen organizing, when we talk about civic space in Uganda.
Okay. So my first comment, I'll start with my favorite issue at heart: women's engagement, women's rights. So first of all, when you look at the composition of political actors in the government who are women, we have this what would call tokenism. We are given a few representatives of women with pseudo power, not exactly real power. So they are more, some of them are more like placeholders. You do not see a real exercise and representation of women issues. For example, I'll speak to what's happening in terms of when you talk about legislation that directly touches issues of women's rights, talking about marriage rights. We have been recently in this discussion about the marital property issue, the case of ERISA, and you can see that this all stems from a question of the laws that we have. And we can see there is no political will to have these discussions because it's not the priority. The priority is also reflected in the financial commitments. When you look at our budgets, you will see the financial commitments given to women's rights issues are very telling of what our government priorities are, but also the people placed there to represent the community. Some of the conversations you'll see and comments made by our political leaders, not necessarily women, you'll see that they're out of touch with reality or with what is going on on ground, out of touch with the economic situation, because they are insulated. They're insulated by the power they hold. They have the access to control the financial resources for their benefit primarily, and then the crumbs are left to the remaining people. When you're talking about the issue about the elective process, Robert mentioned something earlier about civic organizing and civil societies empowering people to exercise their elective processes, but also how such organizations are targeted during elections. It's because those organizations, those civil society organizations, will be empowering people to exercise their liberties to elect a leader that will have their best interests in heart. So this empowerment is not even at all financial empowerment. It is knowledge empowerment so that they know how processes work. You'll find that most times during elections, it has been said that the elites are the ones who least participate in elections because they know that going to the ballot will be a waste of time because the outcome is nonetheless the same. It has been the same for a very long time. So what is the point of taking time to stand in the hot sun? You might even end up having security incidences at the ballot places because people are protesting stuffed ballot boxes. All that has been talked about evidently. So for people who are categorized as elites, they would rather sit back than go through the election process because it does not yield fruit. But if you have a community that is given hope to exercise their powers and go to the ballot and entrust their power and and mandate to a government that they believe in, that is seen as a threat. That's where the threat stems from. So when you're talking about the issues of representation, they are targeted lines of restriction on how is this community being empowered. That if you have an empowered community that knows that the process is supposed to be democratic, would not have issues of people just accepting money to stuff ballot boxes. It would be an empowerment that would enable a community to stand up against oppressive measures or illegitimate methods of legitimizing a government that, of course, will have the process for the show of it, but in the back end, there are other things being done that do not speak to the rule of law. So if you have a community that is empowered, then the tools that will be used, that is the people being used to, because all these things that are happening are not happening in the vacuum. If it is stuffing of ballot boxes, this is being done by people. If it is election fraud, it's being done by people. So if we have a space of organizing where we can have a solid community that can stand up and voice out against all these illegalities, and maybe it would be an ideal situation really, but would have less people at the disposal of the government to use for its illegitimate purpose, then you'd see the effect of citizen organizing. So one of the ways that an undemocratic government would have to target this power that is held by the people would have to stem from the fact of organizing. You go down to the root of where do these people have to start organizing from. And when you're talking about even civic organizing, this organizing does not necessarily have to be through an organization like a civil society, a CSO. Yes? It can just be even a group of people, group of youth. You've seen most of the missing persons, the torture reports that have been going on. A lot of youth who align with a certain political leader have been targeted. These youth are not necessarily organized in a very systematic structure. This is just people who have hope come together as a voice. So you can really see the power of having the knowledge of how these processes work, that you can point out that this is legitimate, and no, we shall not have this, and we shall have that. And you see that people are exercising their power, not even necessarily with the backup of finances, but just having voice. So when you have an empowered civic space doing all that work, of course, there will be a situation where the powers that be are threatened. And going into the interplay of non-discrimination, it all also goes to situations when it comes to these abuses and targeting of the communities. You will see that there is a trend that there are certain people who are deemed not touchable. Yes, and that in itself, there is a form of insulation that they have, that when there is when there is targeted attacks, there is discrimination in terms of classes, there is discrimination in terms of who belongs where, who affiliates with what, but also when you present as a women's rights organization, when it comes to speaking to certain issues that might not be agreeable to the current people in power, for example, you're talking about reproductive and sexual rights, it's something that has been seen as a threat, but it's also blanketed with the fact that this may also speak to something political. When you see when they are restricting issues of funding, they'll say this civil society is being funded by this donor, or they are organizing for this issue. It might be a discussion on sexual reproductive health rights, but they assume that within there you're going to have a political discussion. But also they assume that you are making people lose trust in the government because you're pointing out obvious inconsistencies in their mandate to deliver. Yes.
All right, thank you so much, Bukira Maria, who is the who works with the Women's Pro Bono Initiative, and she's a human rights lawyer and also a human rights activist, and that's why I had to throw in the question around women participation. Robert, you've listened to Maria, and I want you to make a comment on Parliament, the behavior of Parliament. We've seen on many occasions Parliament raising concerns over governments, in particular security agencies, their behavior, their continuing violation of human rights that has been exhibited in form of arbitrary arrests, unlawful detention, and torture. We've also seen commissions of inquiry into these acts that have almost come to nothing. And basically, there's nothing new. What alternatives do we have to hold government accountable? If for example, Parliament can get it done, we know what happens in the judiciary. What alternatives do we have as citizens?
Felix, for us to have a free civic space is a continuous struggle. So when you have such attacks directed at you, you do not relent. You push back, because the moment you give up, you give the attacker the opportunity to continue closing the space. So it is a struggle. Certain things you'll achieve today, certain things you'll achieve tomorrow. That's what I think.
Okay, there was a comment that came through the screen, I think from local communities, saying that the best course of action is to have the masses empowered through civic education and mindset change, basically putting power back to their hands. I'm still with you, Okot, on that one.
Yes.
I don't know whether you followed the Attorney General. I think was it last week, this week, where he was informing the UN Convention. I think it was accounting
Yes.
and on torture, that government, according to the Attorney General, is that government takes action on perpetrators of acts of torture. But I was trying to look through a number of reports that have come that have put Uganda in not in a very good light, and I'm asking myself, For example, the November killings of 2020, we don't know what action has been taken until now. People are still demanding for action. The abductions that have been happening, Parliament was pushing for an accountability of the missing persons. And my question to you is really, what explains the perceived, I'll call it perceived, probably we don't know what's happening behind the scenes, but the perceived reluctance of the state to take action against those responsible?
Now, Felix, if you watch the Attorney General very well, by the way, he's a very articulate lawyer, and he hardly stammers when he's presenting on certain issues. But if you watch properly, you must have seen him struggling to make that defense. But back to the discussion, you see, there is having the legal framework, but the most important bit of it is accountability for human rights violations. Because the moment you don't hold accountable you don't hold those that have been identified to be in violation of people's human rights, then even the legal framework loses sense. It is an issue of accountability. Yes, you have the laws, but if you can't hold people accountable, then you're doing nothing. And that meeting he was in is one of the international human rights law mechanisms where states periodically come and report on their progress in terms of protection, promotion, and the fulfillment of their citizens' rights. So you find that states like us always struggle when it comes to certain aspects of human rights. And the issue is on holding people accountable.
Thank you so much. Maria, I'm coming back to you. Going by the trends, because the truth is, for the last 10 years, the civic space landscape in Uganda has changed rapidly, from better to worse. I may put it that way. Looking at where we are and observing the trends, what should we look out for in 2026?
Like you say, there is nothing new under the sun that is happening. So in 2026, towards elections, if we have them, yes, it's an if we have them.
It's a big if.
Yes. You have. It also it's a big if really, because we have seen also another trend of coups happening, governments, people not trusting that the process will lead to a legitimate decision. So there have been issues of coups, coup d'etats. So we are hoping that we do not go down that road, because it has economic implications. Of course, it has social implications. And currently we are in an economic regression that we do not want something to add on to it. But looking at that, I think it's the same trend that has been happening in terms of civil society organizations that speak to specific issues of electoral processes being witch hunted, being targeted, but also individual witch hunts. Because as Robert said, that the attack is not on civil society, the attack is on civil liberties. So for everyone who tries to exercise this civil liberty to the detriment of the powers that be, there will be repercussions. And we have seen that there have been disappearances of people, there have been arrests, there have been all those things that happen towards the election periods. It's been a consistent trend of something happening electoral year in, electoral year out. Of course, there'll be those issues of the electoral petitions, but I believe it does not have to be that way. If we could have the empowerment, but also our leaders to accept that a time comes that you serve, these offices are entrusted, you hold them in trust for the people. So when your time comes, that you let another take charge through the proper legitimate process. But if that liberty is not exercised, while some people may cower back, there'll be those that will not relent, that will push back. And in that friction of going back and forth, it will depend on the methods that the state exercises to use against those who are not relenting. But of course, on the side of community and civil society actors, our processes of fighting back have always been through organizing. They've been legitimate. They have been through knowledge sharing, empowerment of communities to voice. We have been using our voice to sound abroad, our voices to sound all over, so that we can have a change by the people, for the people. But that is something that has not been realized because of the restrictions that we face, because we'll have these discussions, but there is the reality that is on ground. There are the threats, and not that even those who do not speak against what has happening. There are times, another trend that I've seen, there's a trend of silence on the part of the people who are supposed to hold um, the government accountable. But that silence is not that because is not that that actors are not interested, but it's also that they will be whisked away because they have voiced a certain opinion. Some resort to silence, some cower back. So you're going to be having that mix of people going into silence. Some will be louder than ever. Of course, there will be the pulling of ropes, and we know what our pulling of ropes means in this government. There will be the use of the dispose of resources available. That will be financial resources being used, security resources being used, and all of this has an effect on the community. But the trend will not change much. It's what happens year in, year out, unless there is there is by the grace of God, I will say that there is an acceptance to have a clear democratic process, that there is no rigging of elections, there is no threats being made to individuals. All these are being documented and reported about. There is no instances of people saying we are seeing these numbers appearing on screens and what, but if we do not have the proper democratic process, we'll have that back and forth, and obviously the usual aftermath of electoral petition number this of 2026.
Thank you so much. And partly touches the principle of the dimension of participation, the principle of free and fair elections going into 2026. We have about under 10 minutes to bring this discussion to a close. But before we come to a close, Robert, I want you to comment on the media freedoms. I know very well that these are provided for under the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. In fact, they have described um, the access to information as oxygen of democracy. That's how important it is. And I want you to comment. If we know that the source of oxygen, let's say as a journalist, for example, what is your take on the current press freedoms in Uganda? We've also seen another disturbing law that has been enacted, the Computer Misuse Act, on top of the many draconian laws that seems to be constraining this space of expression.
Now, Felix, the state of media freedom in Uganda right now can be termed as worrying. Because you see, you also need to remember that a free media is very important when it comes to enjoyment of other rights, information, speech, but also a free media is important in documentation of human rights violations. So, in an environment where civic space is constantly under attack, the media will also be uh, affected because they will also be targeted. Because no human rights violator wants their actions to be documented. So, if you are attacking civil society or civic space, you also need to ensure that the media is under control. And that is very challenging because, in the end, we lose proper accounts of these violations. We may not be able to hold some people accountable now, but with proper documentation, even 50 years from now, there can be accountability. I think that's what I could say.
All right, all right. Quickly, let me come to you, Maria. On the, under the, I don't know whether you're familiar with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development Assistance Committee, the OECD DAC, and the recommendations they made, whether they are really context appropriate. And let me pick out one which speaks to that recommends that donor governments provide financial support to CSOs both in development and humanitarian context in their own right. And the current funding mechanism that is coming to civil society, for example, I need your comment whether it is alive to the operational context of Uganda in fulfilling that recommendation.
Thank you, Felix. I believe that once that recommendation was made, it's also to stop the going practice where 90% or 80% of funding has been donor funding, because once you have that situation, there's always also been that attack that these are foreign agendas. So the mind of a development partner externally is to support, yes, is to support the activities of what the nation is doing, not to be the driving force. So once this recommendation is made that the government provide more funding for the operations of civil society, it's with that mind that the government should be interested. And once there is interest in civil society action, there should be evidence of financial commitment and realization of those financial commitments. Otherwise, you'll find situations, of course, civil society tries to organize and have financing through local initiatives, but those are also supplemented. Now, the problem is when the supplementary support is bigger than the local support. That also speaks to the priorities of the government in terms of human rights realization. So this recommendation holds inside the context that we have, and it's more to push our government and also to push us as civil society actors to look within, organize locally, and own this agenda. Otherwise, we have situations where most funding is external, and there comes the notion or the narrative that this is a foreign driven agenda. But that abuse is used through the window of having a big percentage coming from external funding. So to also have the solution for the abuse of that gap, the recommendation is that the government should feed in that gap. But of course, as we are at the moment, also our government is struggling financially. At least it states, because there are some extremes. There is the extreme evidence of poverty in some instances, then there is the extreme flourishing of certain individuals. So the economic gap is very wide, and sometimes the question is, does our government not have financing, or it does not have financing for specific issues? Because when you're talking about certain issues in terms of there are certain issues where you see that the commitment to have, but when you're talking about economic, social rights, health issues, you're talking about economic issues of people, there are no finances. So also sometimes you lose the picture, and have a question: is our government really struggling financially, or it's just struggling financially for certain issues, which are the economic, social, and cultural rights?
Thank you so much. And we are really coming to an end of today's edition, where we've been discussing the state of civic space in Uganda, and what does the future hold for citizen organizing. Let me first read the comment that came through from Esero before I close. Can you flash that comment? Yes, I said, on this same date in 2020, Ugandans witnessed the senseless shooting of citizens by security officials, and over 50 citizens lost their lives. How can Uganda improve on its record of human rights? Okot, as your parting shots, how do we improve our record? I think let's even make this broader. How do we improve the state of civic space in Uganda? Because human rights is just one of the dimensions. Moving forward, as your parting shots in a minute.
Felix, before I get to that question, you had asked Maria something that brought into perspective the role of the international community when it comes to some of these things. First of all, we need to know that under international relations, no country or no state has another state's interests as its priority. So if America is giving any support to Uganda, its interests come first, not Uganda's interests. So that is something that we need to note. You have seen the DGF being disturbed. Has the EU closed operations in Uganda? No, because probably what DGF has been supporting is not their priority. They have their own interests. But getting back to the question that Abel asked, how do we improve the situation? First of all, we have the legal framework. We have an act on enforcement of human rights. We have a beautifully written constitution with international instruments domesticated. The missing link is accountability, holding people that perpetuate these violations accountable. The day we deal with that, our issues will be almost done. Thank you. Felix, you are muted.
Oh, sorry. Maria, your parting shots as we close this.
Okay. My parting shot is that the power belongs to the people, and once we are able to organize and have the power vested in the people, have a free flow of operation, then we'll see some change. Because much as we have all these legal frameworks, the operating environment is suffocating. we have this notion of the power belongs to the people on paper. We need to reach a situation where we can have the practicability and realization of this power that they say we hold, that you can go to a ballot and cast a vote and know that it will be counted, not necessarily to turn out in your favor, but to trust that there is integrity in the process. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That was Bukira Maria, who is a human rights lawyer and a woman rights activist currently working with the Women's Pro Bono Initiative. She's also a social justice lawyer, and also she's passionate about social change. Also with me, I had Okot Robert, who is an advocate of the High Court and has worked with the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, also worked with the Alliance for Finance Monitoring, is also a human rights lawyer, and is currently doing part-time advocate. Is doing part-time advocate at PILAC. PILAC is Public Interest Law Clinic. And this brings us to a close. Your host remains Felix Kafuma. Until next week, same time. Bye-bye. Take care. God bless.